Welcome back to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. This week's episode, we are very excited to be joined by Amanda Foster, who is in her first season covering the men's and the women's team this year for Inside the Hall. Before we bring Amanda in, I just wanted to quickly mention the news that kind of came out earlier today on Twitter. We had a short post on the site about it. The Indiana-Kentucky series, it's something that's been mentioned for the last couple of weeks as a possibility, something that I think a lot of IU fans believe that may never happen again. But it does sound like there's a chance that this series is going to come back in the somewhat near future. John Rothstein reporting that the two schools are in advanced discussions to bring the series back with potentially on-campus games and neutral court games. I think overall, my perspective on this has been pretty consistent. I think it's a great thing if both schools can kind of get on the same page for how they want to handle the series. Obviously, I don't think Indiana necessarily wanted to take this to a neutral court only. I think that they definitely want to have the home and home aspect of it. That's been their position for a long time. And from Kentucky's side of things, since John Calipari's been there, he's been more than clear that he prefers to have the neutral court. So I think if the two programs can come to a agreement and get this done, I think it'd be great for the fan bases. As someone that obviously grew up in Southern Indiana watching these games as a kid, I think it was just a good thing to have the two bordering states and two programs playing on a year basis. We'll see how that happens. But and I wanted to have Amanda on this week on the show just to first introduce her to the listeners. She's going to be someone that her and along with William McDermott are going to be on the podcast periodically throughout the season. But one thing that's a theme this year with both programs is high expectations, men's and women's. The men were picked to finish first in the unofficial Big Ten media poll in the preseason. The women were picked to finish third by the coaches in the preseason poll, second by the media. And I'm curious, I want to start with the men's program first, Amanda. From your perspective, for Indiana to kind of reach that expectation in your mind, what are some things that you feel like have to go right for that to happen? Because that's obviously Indiana hasn't had a winning record in the Big Ten since the 2015-16 season. So it's been a while. So all of a sudden talking about winning Big Ten titles feels like a pretty big leap.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just thank you for having me on. I always love to talk about basketball. I think everything has to go right, honestly, I think for the men. I've been kind of surprised at the extent to which they've been ranked first by almost everybody. Obviously, there's a lot of talent coming back, especially compared to a lot of the other Big Ten teams and with all of the freshmen coming in. And there's a lot of good things going for them, but we haven't seen them play at all. And so I'm a little bit not skeptical, not pessimistic, but also I want to see them on the court before I make a lot of big predictions, I guess. But I think one thing that has to happen, especially, is for Trace Jackson Davis, he has to be able to match up against people who are bigger than him, because last season that was kind of an issue against some of the Big Ten teams. And he's talked a lot about working on his shooting in the offseason, and that actually has to come to light. And he has to be able to make the 3-pointers or even just up at the basket and be consistent, because he's the driving force of the team. And everybody's talked about it at every media day, every conversation. It seems like he's the backbone. And so he has to be really good. They need to keep consistent with the defense that we saw kind of come as the season went on last year. I think that's going to be another big thing, because you have to obviously supplement any good scoring with even better defense to be able to match up against some of the teams that they're playing, because they have a tough schedule and a lot of things are going to have to go into beating those big teams.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of those points. I would say, just from following this program as closely as I have for such a long period of time, the number one thing that kind of stands out to me is just the shooting from the perimeter and where it's going to come from. You look at what they did from a roster perspective this offseason. They brought in some really good freshmen. They didn't obviously bring in any transfers, but I don't know necessarily that I feel like they've addressed the problem of 3-point shooting. Parker Stewart was their best 3-point shooter last year, and he's gone. I'm not saying that him leaving is going to be a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but you looked at up and down the roster, and there's guys that are capable of making 3-point shots, but you don't know that any of them are going to do it consistently. Miller Kopp showed last season that he could make shots at times, but he had that big game early in the season against Syracuse, and then I don't think scored in double figures again until later in the season. Tamar Bates is a guy that came in with a ton of expectations, and he showed a lot of confidence offensively, but you look at his shooting percentages last year, they were among the 2 or 3 worst on the team. And I think there's a lot of people that are just expecting that all of a sudden he's going to become a better shooter or he's going to be able to break through. And kind of like what you said when you opened, it was like, it's great that they've been picked this high, but you actually want to see it happen. And I think that's kind of where I'm sitting too. I didn't pick Indiana to win the Big Ten. I had them in my offseason power rankings. I had them first. But then once I started studying the league a little bit more and looking at the schedules, which I think have a ton to do with who actually wins the regular season title, I think Illinois has a more favorable path schedule-wise. Do you agree with kind of the shooting piece that I'm mentioning there? And one thing that kind of stood out to me watching Hoosier Hysteria, watching the shooting competitions, you had the women on one end of the court and the men on the other, and the women had better shooters than the men do. And that was one thing that's kind of struck me from watching the two programs the last couple of years. They've been a better shooting team, the women's program. So to me, you can talk about Trace Jackson Davis, defense, those are obviously key, but to me, a lot of it's going to come down to, can they make perimeter shots with any consistency?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with all of the shooting that you just talked about. And Hoosier Hysteria, it was funny because you had Miller Kopp and Claymore McNeil. And I'm covering the women's team last year. I could tell, and then watching the men as a fan, the shooting was very different. And to have Chloe come out and outshoot Miller, basically, they were a team, but she still shot better than he did. I think a lot of people were surprised, and I was not really, because I saw the inconsistency with Miller shooting last year, and Chloe didn't shoot a lot of threes last year, but when she did, she was usually at least relatively consistent. So it was an interesting thing to see. I think a lot of people are going to be looking to Miller Kopp just because of the amount that he's talked about his own work from beyond the arc, and I'm going to be looking at him too. And I would definitely agree that it has to come together on the floor in a game situation. We obviously don't know if that's going to, but I think if it doesn't, then that, they're not going to do as well as people think they will.
So the expectations for the women's team are obviously high as well, maybe not quite as high as the men's, which, you can debate whether that should be the case or not based on previous performance, but also you've got an Iowa team on the women's side that's a consensus, I think, pick to win the league, and they've got the best player maybe in the whole country, depending on who you want to, list up there in Caitlin Clark. So I think it's fair that Iowa's picked first, but the Indiana women have also kind of over a long period of time now under Terry Morin shown that they're going to be competing near the Big Ten. I know you covered the team very closely last year. There are obviously some key departures from the roster, but if Indiana is going to be in that conversation to compete at the top near or at the top of the Big Ten on the women's side, what do you feel like maybe are the keys for them to do that and to maybe avoid, dropping off and being, instead of top 2 or 3 being 4th or 5th? What's the difference between those two? Yeah,
I feel like some of the biggest losses that the women had from the last season to this season has obviously been on the defense, losing Nicole Carter-New-Hillary and Allie Patberg and even Alexa Goulet underneath the basket with her height. And so they're going to have to figure out how to change the defense, because nobody can just come in and replace any of those three, especially Nicole Carter-New-Hillary, because there's nobody that plays like her. And so I think they have to figure out, and Terry Moore talked about this at Media Day a little bit, that she's very proud of their defense and that she thinks they have one of the best defenses in the league. And they did last year, and that just has to carry over this year, but it has to do so in a different way. And so I think the mindset behind that is going to be a big thing of, for the returning players, they can't count on somebody at half court defending. So they have to figure out how to change that and change their own expectations while also bringing in, they have some really good freshmen, but I think they're going to need to adapt quickly, because there's a chance that more will be put on them this year than last year, because there doesn't seem, at least right now, to be that sort of like solid starting five. There's a little bit more speculation in the lineup than there was last year. And so they all just kind of have to come together. There's not, at least right now, it seems like it's tight knit of a group just because there are a lot of incoming transfers and freshmen. And while the chemistry off the court seems like it's great and they all get along, there's the other question of if it actually works once they start playing in the games. And so similarly to the men, I guess, you just have to get out there and see what things look like. But I think overall, in terms of Big Ten play, defense is going to be the key for them to figure out, because the women, at least last year in the Big Ten, it was a little bit more defense heavy than offense heavy. And that's just how the game goes. That's how it works. And so if you don't have a good, strong defensive unit, then I think that would allow them, not allow them, but that would make them drop further than people expect they will.
How big of a question is the depth on the women's team? Because from watching them last season, I noticed that they like to ride their starters and maybe their first or second player off the bench, like basically the whole game. Like, it wasn't like they were going, Mike Woodson talks about, hey, we want to play 10 guys this year, which I don't necessarily think that's what he's actually going to do. That's kind of what you have to say in the preseason, because you don't want guys 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 thinking I have no shot to play. But I think when you get into the meat of your schedule, you play, you try to play your 8 best players. Maybe you go 9 deep. But on the women's side, the rotation seemed a little bit tighter last season. I'm curious what you think in terms of, they've obviously lost some key players, so they're going to have to play maybe some unproven names. Do you feel like they're going to have the pieces on the bench and these newcomers are going to be able to offer up the level of production that they're going to need in order to compete to be at or near the top of the conference? I
think first of all, there is going to be more depth this year than last year, because there are a few more transfers, there are a few more people with experience this year. You're totally right. In last year, Terry Morin would ride her starting five as much as she possibly could, and really only bring in 1 or 2 players off the bench. And I think that she has seen that she can't do that this year, just because there really aren't, that's just not how it's going to work with this roster. And I think with the addition of like players like Sarah Scalia and Sydney Parrish and people who have more experience, that they might not start every game, because like she talked about Chloe Moore McNeil getting the chance to start and have good minutes. And so that frees up another spot on the bench in a way to have that experienced player come in later. And so I could see her going maybe like 7 or 8 deep. I don't think it's going to be as deep as maybe Mike Woodson or even other Big Ten women's basketball teams, but I think it's going to be deeper than last year. And she talked about it at Media Day. I asked her a question and she said, I hope we can go deeper. And so I think that if she sees the potential, then they will, but she also recognized that they have to play for her to be able to see if they can play or not. She's not going to not start the freshman, or not. I don't think she's going to start the freshman, but I think she'll put them in later in the game, especially in the beginning of the season, in the non-conference games, to see what they're made of. And I think she realized from last year going into this year that that's something that you have to do to be able to see if your team can work as a whole, because she does have some talented freshmen like Yarden Garzan. I would be shocked if she doesn't play good minutes, if she lives up to the expectations surrounding her. And last year I would have been shocked if almost any freshman got on the floor at all. So,
yeah. We've talked about kind of the upside, obviously, for both of these programs and, the things that have to go right. But let's say that we're having this conversation again in early March and the bracket's getting ready to come out for the men's team. And, Indiana's not the Big Ten champion and they're 5th or 6th, or they're somewhere further down, the standings in the Big Ten. What do you think will have not gone according to plan in order for that to happen? Is it as simple as the shooting? Is it as simple as kind of getting caught up in these preseason expectations and not realizing that you still have to go out and earn it? Is there anything in particular that you think is, I guess, a potential pitfall for the men's team entering the season?
I feel like in a way it's as simple as shooting, because if you shoot and you don't make it, then obviously you're not going to do very well. Right. So there's that's the baseline. But I could see how shooting would become an issue if, you start out the season and either they start out really well shooting or they don't. And then it kind of, if it carries on, then that becomes like a mental thing. And then you start thinking about the preseason expectations and the fans and everybody. and like, oh, we're not living up to what people want to see and we're not doing this and that, because they all are supposed to be good on paper. And if you're not as good as you're supposed to be, then obviously that's going to become a mental issue, which will then go on to the court and become a performance issue. And so I think if one thing were to go wrong, it would be the shooting. But I think it would not just be the shooting at the end of the day. It would turn into a lot more. And because one of the things I was thinking about before coming on is that they have to perform well in front of fans here in Bloomington. Because if you don't perform well in front of your home crowd fans, they will not like you, as we saw last year. And so with the amount of important games that they're going to have here, I think consistency, performing well in Assembly Hall is going to be a big thing. And if they can't do that, then that's just another thing to add on to the list of things that didn't go right, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that really pop in my head in terms of, Indiana not reaching its expectations. I think the tough non-conference schedule can work in Indiana's favor if they go out and perform and win some of those games. But all of a sudden, if you lose at Xavier, you lose North Carolina, you only split with Arizona and Kansas, and say you go 1-3 of those games, say you lose all 4, because that's not. You think about it: at Xavier, North Carolina at home, Arizona on a neutral court at Kansas. Realistically, they might be favored in 1 or 2 of those games, but there's a chance they could not win any of those games. And I think that kind of ties into what you're talking about with the mental part of it. If they had these high expectations going in and they falter the first month and a half of the season, then all of a sudden it starts to become, you guys aren't as good as everyone said you were, and it can kind of snowball. The other thing is, when you look at the teams that win the Big Ten, typically, this is the year of the big man in the league and really across the country, but guard play is so important. And Xavier Johnson is a guy who I think a lot of people have given the benefit of the doubt in terms of putting him on the preseason second or third team all Big Ten going into season. I think the talent is there for him to do that. But we also saw last season, there was a lot of instances where he didn't play to that level. He played that way late in the season. That's why Indiana made the tournament. So if he doesn't play that way consistently, and let's say Jalen Hood-Schifino isn't as good as maybe people think, the guard play to me then becomes a question mark. So I think those two things are potential, areas to watch as the season moves along, because I think everyone's excited about this non-conference schedule, but I've been, a couple people have asked me, like, what do you think would be good for these? I think if they split those games, I think they've done really well, because at Xavier, as I mentioned, is going to be very tough. That's going to be a rocking atmosphere. Sean Miller's back there for his first season. They're going to be a good team. North Carolina at home. North Carolina's probably going to come into Bloomington number 1 or in the top 5. At Kansas, nobody really wins there. And then Arizona and Las Vegas, there's going to be obviously a strong showing of Indiana fans out there, but there's also going to be a ton of Arizona fans. And Arizona was a really good team last year, and Tommy Lloyd is one of the better coaches in America right now with what he did with that program last year. He's a longtime Gonzaga assistant. So, I think those are kind of the things that I look at and say, if things don't go right, I think getting off to a slow start and kind of letting that snowball mentally, and then also the guard play not being what people expected. I think those kind of at the top of the list. On the women's side, let's say Indiana's 6th in the Big Ten this year. What do you think will have gone wrong for that to happen?
I think, honestly, my first thought would be people get hurt. And I think that is one of the biggest things that could go wrong for them if Mackenzie Holmes gets hurt again, or if she even comes back this season, not to the same level that she was at the beginning of last season. If Grace Berger gets hurt, like if any of the big minute players get injured for a good amount of time, I think that's just going to force Terry Moore to go to her bench. I think more than she expects that she'll have to, and just kind of there could be a potential snowball effect with that. I think another thing that could go wrong is the defense is just not up to par. Obviously, I mentioned it earlier, they're going to have to adjust and come up with some new defensive strategies to accommodate the players they have on the team. And if that doesn't quite match up with their opponents, or if it doesn't work as smoothly as it did last year, because even last year they struggled defensively against players like Caitlin Clark and other big good teams. And so I think, yeah, other than the injuries, the defense is going to be the big thing. If they get off to a slow start, if they go play Tennessee and get crushed by Tennessee, who knows? Their non-conference schedule is not as difficult, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be super easy with the amount of adjusting that they might have to do for new players and new strategies and things like that. So it's kind of where I stand. Shooting could be an issue, but I don't see that impacting the game as much as it would on the men's side. And I think, if someone told me at the end of the season, if Indiana finished in the lower levels of the Big Ten, my first thought would be, well, who got hurt and what happened and why? So,
right. What sense do you get right now in terms of Mackenzie Holmes' health? Is that something that people are worried about close to the program going season? Does she seem to be? I don't know if you talked to her at media day, but if you've talked to Coach Morin or anybody with the program about this, but I know obviously her availability and last year down the stretch and her not being able to play at the level that she was accustomed to was a problem at times. They obviously still had a really successful, run in the NCAA tournament, but I think there's a lot of people who may believe that if she was 100%, maybe things turn out a little bit differently. What is her status going into the season, and are there any, I guess, ongoing concerns about her health moving forward?
From what I know, I don't think so. I was not able to talk to her media day. I don't think she was out at the tables for very long. But I haven't noticed anything. She seems, she was running around at Hoosier Hysteria and everything seemed fine. And even like you said, by the end of last season in the UConn game, she wasn't back to 100%, but she was up there. And so I think over the summer and heading into the season, I don't think there's a big thing to watch for right now. It would just kind of be like in the middle of a game, if something goes wrong, if she lands funny and something happens with her knee again or something like that. But I don't think there's going to be any big concern as of right now heading into the season.
One last thing on this, and I just want to get your thoughts. If you had to project a starting five going into the season, I'll give my project. People ask me, I'll give my projected for the men's team, and then you can give your for the women's. For the men's, I will say Xavier Johnson, obviously at the point guard. I think Jalen Hood-Schifino starts as well in the backcourt. I think Miller Kopp will start at the three. Mike Woodson, he started them all last season. I know that there's a lot of people who wonder maybe does Jordan Geronimo or Tamar Bates get a crack there, but I think with Miller Kopp coming back for another season, I don't see his role changing much. And then obviously Race Thompson and Trace Jackson Davis in the front court. So I think that's kind of my prediction for the men. Do you agree with, I guess, two-parter, do you agree with that on the men's side? And what's your projection for the women's team in terms of a lineup?
Yeah, no, I think I definitely do agree with on the men's side. I think that makes sense. It's to be expected in a way. For the women, Mackenzie Holmes, Grace Berger, because that feels like a no-brainer. I would say probably Alyssa Jerry starting as a forward. That's three. And then I always lose track when I do these. I just start saying names. Sarah Scalia, probably. I would be surprised if she doesn't actually, because it seems like she's able to kind of take on a lot of different roles. When Terry Morton talked about it at media day, and then I could see Chloe Moore McNeil being in the run at the top of the list, at least for being that fifth. You could go with Sydney Parrish up there. There could be a lot of ins and outs, but I think I would go to Chloe Moore McNeil just because of the experience that she's had. And she seems to have made a lot of improvements over the summer. If you talk to anybody related to the team, they're going to point to her as kind of like that breakout player this year. And so I think she's going to get a lot of chances. And if she doesn't start in the beginning of the season, I wouldn't be surprised if she starting later as the season goes on. Yeah,
I think it's a good thing for them that you're at least having to think about it, right?
Exactly.
That last year it was kind of a no-brainer of what was going to happen, and these are the guys that they're going to or the women that they're going to consistently play on a game-to-game basis. I think having better depth, especially for a team that plays as hard as they do and focuses as much on defense, I think when you don't play as big of a rotation, and this happened too with the men last year, I felt like down the stretch, Trace Jackson Davis, Race Thompson, they looked tired. And you play all these games, and by the time you get to February, you're just ready to get to the tournament, and you're getting beat up on a night in, night out basis. And I think for both programs, having better depth going into the season will hopefully help them be, more healthy as the season goes along, and also more fresh when you get to the most important time of year, which is tournament. So we also asked for some questions from listeners, and we had several submitted on the women's team that I want to get to. There are a couple quick questions on the men's side that I'll just address. Someone asked just about the recruiting for 2023. Gabe Cupps and Ja'Kai Newton both commit early, and Indiana really didn't do anything else in terms of commitments besides those two players. And is there anything to be concerned about? I would say at this point, with the transfer portal still being out there for the spring, you don't really panic in terms of recruiting at any level of basketball, because there's going to be players that are going to enter the portal, and there's going to be a chance to improve your team in the spring. Was it ideal that Indiana struck out on guys like Jamie Kaiser and Ayrton Page and Deshaun Harris-Smith? There's go down the list. TJ Power was a guy that they tried to recruit and they weren't successful. Obviously, you want to build your program through high school recruiting as much as possible if you can get those impact players, but I also don't think it's the end of the world if you strike out on some of those. If Indiana has a really good season and does a lot of the things that are being projected in the preseason, there's going to be guys in the portal that want to come and be a part of a winning program. Now, the problem becomes if Indiana is disappointing again this year and maybe doesn't live up to those expectations, I think it becomes harder to recruit at that point, and then maybe you get a little worried. But I think you save those worries for another day, and the portal has really changed, just like with NIL. It really changed college sports, and there's going to be guys available for Indiana to pick up. The other question that I got was someone said that I went against the grain and picked Illinois to finish first in the Big Ten, and IU finished second. The question why I did that, and I think I mentioned that earlier. Kind of a few reasons. One, Illinois has a more favorable schedule. Two, and Amanda said this kind of earlier when she talked about the team, these projections are, you can understand why they're happening, but you also want to actually see it before you believe in it. Now, Illinois, like Indiana, has a ton of question marks. They added a ton of new players. They lost significant contributors in Alfonso Plummer, Trent Frazier, Kofi Coburn. I mean, those are players that were obviously, pivotal to their success last year. But with Indiana, they finished 48th last year in KenPom, and they were basically a 17-point second half comeback away, not happening against Michigan. And we're talking about the season in a whole different light. If that doesn't happen, I don't think we're having any of these conversations, because they wouldn't have made the tournament, and then we're thinking about them in a totally different light. So that's kind of why I'm not saying that I don't think Indiana I'm not saying that I think Indiana has no chance to win the Big Ten. I just have been burned, I guess, too many years in a row not picking them a little bit higher, and I'm not going to go and pick them first this year. So I got them second. I think that's fair going into the season. Amanda, there's several questions that we got here on the women's team, and I want to run through a few of them and let you answer these. Do you have any thoughts on a surprise performer on the team this year going in, and who will replace Allie Patberg and Nikki Cardano Hillary on defense? Because I think that's a pretty big question for the women's team.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest questions out there. I think for a surprise performer, I already kind of touched on it, and so given the extent that people have talked about her, I don't know how much it would be a surprise if Chloe Moore McNeil comes out and is super strong. But from me seeing the way that she played last year, she started out really hesitant, and then as the season went on, she got more confident and started taking more shots. And so she wouldn't be necessarily a surprise, like out of the blue, but comparing the way she played last year to the way that she's expected to play this year, she would be the one that I would point to first. I think Yarden Garzone has the potential to kind of be the player that not a lot of people have heard of if they're not following Indiana basketball or women's basketball. But since she is a freshman and she won't have ever played it on the stage that she will in the NCAA, it's hard to really tell more than like, she sounds like she's good and she seems like she's working hard and could be a big contributor. So between those two, I would go Claymore McNeil. But if I had to pick, it would be those two at the top of the list. And then for replacing Nikki and Allie, first of all, I think, and I've talked about this kind of before, not like on the record, but just in general, of with the loss of the big three kind of from last year. I don't think anybody's going to be able to replace them, and I don't think anyone needs to. Like nobody can go on and play the same way that Cardano Hillary did, and if anybody tried, it wouldn't work out. And so in that regards, like you're not going to have anybody coming on and doing the same thing that either Nikki or Allie were doing because they were so unique and individual in the way that they played. And that's just kind of my take on that. But as a whole, defensively, I think Sydney Parrish is going to come on and be strong. I wouldn't be surprised if Sarah Scalia kind of jumps into a defensive role. Terry Moran talked about her at media days and that she's not just a 3-point shooter, that she can go up and down the court, she can facilitate whatever. So I wouldn't be surprised if she's not underneath the basket just because of her height, but more on the outskirts, kind of being a little pesky, would not surprise me as well. So I think those two would be some of the biggest ones. And obviously transfers, you don't know how they're going to fit in. But that's going to be important. Chloe Moore McNeil has talked about working on her one-on-one defense. She went up against Caitlin Clark for at least a little bit in the Big Ten tournament when Indiana played Iowa. And so she seems really motivated to be a good defensive player. And she kind of knows that she has to step into that role. And so she is another one to keep an eye on both ends of the court. But again, I think the way that her play has improved based on what everybody's been saying, that defense could be a really big thing for her as well.
We had another question kind of focused on Cardano Hillary and watching her the last couple of years. Everything that you like want out of a point guard, I feel like she provided. Like that's what Indiana's really been missing on the men's team. I mean, Xavier Johnson obviously was really good last year, but in terms of just being a spark plug and a leader on the court and somebody that kind of does the little things that help you win, I thought she was excellent. And this question I can just read it. Nikki was such a force initiating the offense last year and providing a constant boost of energy. How will the team's character change this year without her presence? Who steps into her shoes? That kind of made me think like just her presence on the court. I feel like having, you see that sometimes with a lot of teams will have like their emotional leader out there and player that kind of gets everybody involved and is a constant spark of energy. Is there somebody on the team this year that can fill that role, or is that something that is going to have to be more by a committee approach where they're just going to have to maybe a game-to-game basis who fills that void?
I, at least right now, obviously not seeing anybody play this season, I would think it would have to be somewhat more of a committee-based approach, because like you said, there's no one really was like Cardano Hillary, and I don't see anybody on the team right now that has that not the same energy, because there are other players that are very energetic and capable of starting things, but not in the way that she did, in the way that she played, because even if you just stand and watch her move around and annoy the defenders, that's going to get everybody else kind of ready to go. And there's not going to be anybody doing that to the same level this year. People are going to be looking at Mackenzie Holmes and Grace Bergers to be the leaders, but whether that's the emotional leader on the court or just the facilitator and kind of like I'm losing the word, but just kind of the stoic leader, I guess, like Grace Berger is probably going to be more like that than like a very smiley, energetic player, because that's her demeanor. So I think it will have to kind of be a game by game basis of who's playing well and who's the most energetic. And it's going to be a lot more of like a group centered energy. And I think so that could be a downfall, if the whole group isn't able to find that collective energy and they don't have a big spark plug like they did last year. But I can't point to one person that would be able to fill that role.
Last thing I wanted to ask, there was a couple questions about recruiting, but I do believe Indiana just got a commitment over the weekend from a player that's in the state. Top. I think the second best prospect in the state. I think 6'4". That'll be obviously a key addition. But I wanted to ask you, just in general, from media days and for everything you know about the program and the team, and this kind of ties into this question. What lingering questions, I guess, do you still have about this team going into the season? And is there, after watching the first couple games, what are you going to be most interested to learn about this group?
That's a good question. I will say about recruiting, it's a lot harder to follow women's basketball than it is men's, just because it's not covered as much on the high school level. Yeah. I do know the recruit over the weekend, Faith Wiseman, had 22 offers. Iowa, Maryland, a lot of Big Ten schools, Harvard, Penn. So a lot, Terry Morton is doing a good job of getting players. Lene Beaumont had offers from Iowa and a lot of other schools as well, and she committed at the end of last year. So on that side, I think that they're doing well. Going into this season, I think the biggest questions I have are just, on a broad sense, what the team is going to look like and how they're going to play, which is a very basic question. I think everybody has that in the back of their minds, but it's because nobody really knows, because there hasn't been this amount of turnover in the past few years. And so the question kind of behind that is, are they going to be as good as they're expected to be? Because the past 2 seasons they've been good, but they've had the same players for the most part, and the same big leaders and the same big producers. And so now that's going to be changing. In the first few games, I'm going to be looking at the way Mackenzie Holmes is playing just on a basic level, but then also for that leadership aspect, because she took some of it on last year, but she didn't have to take all of it with players like Allie and Nikki. And so for her and Grace this year, I'm going to be looking at them even more, I think. And then I would be really intrigued to see the freshmen come in the beginning and some of the non-conference games that might not mean quite as much, like the exhibition games and whatnot, just to see if there's a chance for them to play later on, and just kind of what that looks like and how they gel with the rest of the team.
Follow her on Twitter at AmandaFoster_15. She will be covering primarily the men's team for Inside the Hall this year, but we're also happy to add some coverage of the women's team. It's been really well received so far on the site, and a lot of people are enjoying it. And I think it's definitely something that the program has earned. And it's awesome to have that coverage as well. So Amanda, thanks for coming on the show today. We'll make sure to have you on throughout the season. Thanks for the time. Yes. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. We will be back soon next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.